Hi everybody, welcome to today's video.
Um, we'll go back like we always do and define a couple of terms here when we talk about this. So technically speaking, what exactly is a drought? A drought is not necessarily the once in a generation dust bowl level lack of rain that we all think of when we hear the term, but it can be thought of in a lot of ways actually by what we would call a dry spell around here. So 3 or more weeks with little to no rain, high temperatures, often in the 90s, sometimes even topping out above that. And that dry spell, that little mini drought, if we want to call it that, can actually be enough of a drought, enough of a lack of rain to damage your house. So it can harm your foundation. It can harm other things around the house. The primary reason why this happens is because of the soil that we build on around here. And there are three main types of soil in Indiana. There are effectively sandy, clay, and what's called a Miami soil, which is kind of a mixture of a whole bunch of things. Indiana actually has a state soil. You'll find that we have a state pretty much everything when you look into it. But our state soil is called Miami soil, which consists of silt, old deposits, and loam, which is a lighter, kind of more air-filled material. The Miami soil holds and drains water effectively, and that makes it invaluable for agricultural uses. It's why we're such a strong agricultural state. As you travel through the state of Indiana, you'll find that different regions of the state have different soil types. Where I grew up in Northwest Indiana, sand is the dominant soil up near Lake Michigan, and in north central and southwestern Indiana, because of ancient river deposits, you'll find a lot of the same sandy type soil. However, Indiana has an abundance of clay-based soils throughout the state. And if you look at a map of those soils, what you see is, well, this. The northern third of the state is kind of that sandy soil. The bottom third of the state is kind of sandy soil over limestone. The middle third of the state, where we are today, is this wonderful clay soil. And this is what actually is going to cause problems during a drought. So here in Indiana, a lot of our soil has a pretty good percentage of clay in it. That clay is made of very small particles, which are very easily packed down. There's a lot of silt in it. There's a lot of other very fine materials that when they're wet, pack very, very closely together. And when they're wet, the clay itself actually holds water. It doesn't drain particularly well, and it doesn't really let air penetrate the soil. When it's wet, the clay actually causes what's called expansive soil, which tends to push in on foundation walls. So that's a problem we're all familiar with dealing with here, is those bowing foundation walls. And that's caused by hydrostatic pressure and that expansive clay soil over time as it remains wet, exerting a constant pressure on the foundation walls of our house and slowly pushing them in. And that predominantly happens to brick foundations and block foundations, not as much to concrete unless it's improperly built, but it's that expansive soil and that constant hydrostatic pressure that actually tends to push foundation walls in here. That happens when it's wet, but what happens when that soil dries out? What happens, in other words, in a drought? So, when we keep that soil, that clay soil wet, it holds onto that water, it pushes in. What happens though when we go through such a prolonged dry spell, that clay soil actually starts to dry out? And remember our definition of a drought, 3 or more weeks of very little rain and higher temperatures. We have certainly gone through that here recently. And granted, we had a pretty good rainstorm on Friday and we got some moisture back in the soil, but it has not been enough to make up the lack of moisture before then. So keep kind of our recent weather patterns in mind as we talk through this, and you're going to see why what we are experiencing right now can actually cause some pretty significant problems for your house. So normally, again, that clay soil is damp, it's pushing in on our foundation, but when it dries out, because it's an expansive soil, that also means it's going to shrink considerably when it gets really dry. That's why we're seeing all these cracks opening up in the ground around us right now, because that expansive clay soil is actually shrinking. And it's shrinking to the point where cracks have to form to relieve the stress in the soil. Um, and we're seeing them in yards, we're seeing them next to driveways, we're seeing them all over the place right now, because our soil around here kind of acts like a sponge, and it is going to shrink when it gets dry. Um, this crack actually is Liz's yard. Actually, all the pictures you're going to see in here, except for the maps and so forth, are taken from actual inspections from our archives and our files. This one is actually Liz's yard, and she has cracks in her yard right now of about an inch or so, because the soil around her house has shrunk so much that she has very large cracks forming in the surface of the soil. The longer the drought goes on, the deeper those cracks are going to go into the earth, and the more problems they're going to cause, because that soil is literally shrinking away from the foundation. So essentially, drought causes our expansive clay soil to shrink. It won't be as bad north of here where there's a lot of sand in the soil. That is a more stable material. It won't be as bad south of here where you have more sand and loam in the soil. But around here, because we have such a high clay content, the drought we've been going through, or the dry spell we've been going through, is actually causing our soil to shrink. So during a drought, the water within clay evaporates and it causes it to shrink. This is going to create cavities or gaps between the ground around our house and our house's foundation. And what that means is that foundation is now going to experience stress in a way that it's completely unused to experiencing. It's used to experiencing constant pressure pushing in on it, but if all of a sudden that soil shrinks away from the foundation, it's going to want to move in the opposite direction, because all of a sudden it won't be supported in the direction in which it's used to being supported. A foundation's job is to basically transfer the weight of the house straight down into the soil, but there's always some lateral force on it. Around here, that lateral force is usually inward, but if all of a sudden we take away that hydrostatic pressure, that expansive soil, and we shrink it away from the foundation, that foundation, in a very real sense, is going to be unsupported where it's always been used to being supported around the outside of the house. So what that means is, due to that sudden lack of support, that foundation can crack as gravity pushes the weight of our houses down and out into those newly created gaps. So that sudden change in static forces can cause actually pretty serious cracking in our foundation. It's very similar to normal settlement and has the same sort of negative effect on our foundation. And while some settling is normal, a drought can cause it to happen at a much faster pace and possibly to a much greater extent. So if you want to think about this as very serious, sudden, accelerated settlement cracking, that is essentially what's going on here. That sudden lack of support on the outside of our foundation walls can cause it to shift and move in kind of an unexpected new direction. So a drought, even a long-term dry spell, can either cause cracking that wasn't there before, or it can accelerate and exacerbate cracking that was already there. And then when it starts to rain again, that can actually be a bad thing too. So think about all that rain we had on Friday and all that water all of a sudden coming back into our soil. That expansive clay soil is then going to quickly absorb that water and swell back up in a short period of time. And that rapid change, that change in static forces, can all of a sudden cause cracking again in our foundation as it tries to move in the opposite direction. So droughts are bad for a couple of reasons. They cause the foundation to lose support. And then if we get a lot of rain in a short period of time and that soil swells right back up, those static forces push in the other direction and can cause problems with that foundation as well. And it eventually leads to something that looks like this. This is a settlement crack that has been exacerbated actually by drought conditions. We've removed some of the support from the corner of this house, which is naturally a very high stress area. And when we did that, we caused that foundation to actually shift. Yes, it's a settlement crack, but it's a rapidly occurring, fairly serious one caused by lack of support in the soil. And then when that soil gets rehydrated, as it were, it's going to push in the opposite direction and tend to exacerbate that hydrostatic pressure because we've changed all the static forces in that equation. So in the end, the most serious problems we see with drought are foundation related because of the very rapid changes that can occur in that expansive clay soil around the house. It's fairly significant here in central Indiana. Other parts of the country, like Texas, have very, very expansive soils that are way worse than what we experience here. So when they have drought and flood conditions in areas like that, it's even worse than what we see here. But a drought essentially causes changes to your foundation because the soil shrinks away from the house, removes some of the support that's there, causes that foundation to settle and move in unexpected directions. And then when you try to push it back together again after the rain, the exact opposite thing happens. So that's kind of in a nutshell and a very simple explanation of how drought affects the foundation in your house. And this is probably the number one thing we see when we talk about droughts and problems with our houses. So how do you fix that? Well, you can actually water your foundation, which sounds a little bit crazy, but in a time of kind of extended drought, and I would seriously think about starting to do this now if our dry weather here is going to continue, you water around the foundation enough to keep the clay from shrinking, but not so much that you're creating excessive hydrostatic pressure around your foundation. So essentially what you want to do is place soaker hoses around that foundation, let them run for half an hour to an hour every day during the cooler evening hours, and keep that soil next to your house damp with kind of a normal level of water so that we keep that soil in the condition it's usually in, not too dry, not too wet, and we keep those forces from changing around our foundation. The caveat I would give you guys right now is beware that there are some municipalities around here with watering restrictions, but it's not like you're watering your yard, your lawn. You're using a soaker hose to keep the soil around your foundation damp. Just be cognizant if your community has those restrictions. That expansive or that shrinking expansive soil can also damage other exterior sources. As we remove support from concrete flatwork, things like driveways and patios and sidewalks, the exact same thing can happen that is happening to our foundation. And in fact, it is oftentimes worse for flat surfaces like patios, sidewalks, driveways, because they're shallow. And the first part of our soil that dries out is obviously the top surface of it. And as again, that soil shrinks, we're removing support from around those flat surfaces. So it is not unusual during a drought where we see the soil shrinking away from the concrete in our yard to actually cause that concrete to lose support. And then we put a car on top of it, and all of a sudden your driveway can really shift and move during a drought. It's for the same reason that we have foundation problems, just on a more rapid accelerated scale, because that concrete and that dirt is sitting out there baking in the sun. But as that expansive soil shrinks, it can cause problems with flat surfaces as well around our houses. This one's actually taken at my driveway and shows that the yard around my driveway and sidewalk here has shrunk by a good half an inch to 3/4 of an inch and is probably starting to shrink underneath the edges of that driveway and sidewalk as that soil continues to dry out. So it can cause problems with exterior concrete as well. It's not just all foundation related. One of the other areas where we see problems during a drought is actually with septic systems, but it's probably not for the reason you think. And actually having a septic system can be, believe it or not, beneficial during a drought. A septic system actually helps return water back into the environment more quickly and efficiently than having a municipal wastewater disposal system, a municipal sewer system. With septic systems, our water source is often a private well, and our septic system, our local wastewater treatment, actually allows clean water to rejoin the groundwater quickly, eventually flowing into streams and lakes and rivers and things like that. So a septic system, in a lot of ways, actually benefits and works better during a drought because it makes it easier for that water to flow back into the earth again. So septic systems, conversely, tend to work better during a drought. But this does pose some problems when buying a house with a septic system during a drought, because this can actually mask septic problems that may be visible during normal conditions because your soil can absorb so much more water during a drought. It's like a dry sponge. It's going to absorb a whole bunch of water before it swells back up again. And it can mask fairly serious septic problems that would otherwise normally be visible. That water is just going to go right down into the ground and disappear, and it may not reveal problems with a leach field or a finger system that are visible when the ground is a little bit more saturated with water. On top of all of that, the test that we do in the inspection industry, the dye push test, which quite frankly is a pretty much worthless test that gets us past some bank paperwork, that dye push test is even more useless than usual during a drought. No effluent whatsoever is going to surface in our leach field during a drought, no matter how much water we try and pump into that septic system. Our ground is going to be so dry during a drought that any water we put into that septic system is just going to be absorbed into the ground. So that dye push test that we do is never going to reveal anything during drought conditions. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to septic systems. They do work better during a drought, but they can absolutely mask some problems going on with them when the ground is so dry. And we've actually seen this happen out there. It's pretty obvious in this picture where the leach field for the septic system actually is. It's right where that nice green grass is, um, but we're not going to be able to tell if there's any problems with it because all that water is going to be going straight down. So again, one of the good things about it is, well, during a drought, we can often tell where the leach field is exactly because you can see where the nice green grass is. We're just going to have a very difficult time seeing problems with that leach field during a drought. Wells can suffer problems during a drought. They can run out of water during severe drought. That's not real common here in central Indiana. We actually sit here atop several huge aquifers, and we have large sections of what's called karst geology, which is basically limestone. It's where karst geology is where caves occur, but that geology tends to hold a tremendous amount of water. So it's not common for us to have wells that run dry here in central Indiana, although it is possible in more southern locations with higher elevations where that water is deeper down, it might sink down below the level of that well. And I have seen that happen occasionally. Actually, I've seen that happen only a couple of times during 2012 where we had a really significant drought early in the year. We did inspect a couple houses way down in Brown County in the hills where they had to put water into the well to continue servicing it because the water table kind of sank down below the level of that well. But it is pretty unusual for that to happen here in central Indiana. And again, if you look at the map of Indiana, this is actually an underground map of our water resources here, and you see it matches pretty closely with the map of soil types. So the blue here in central Indiana, we are sitting atop a huge reservoir of fresh water here that is not very deep down. So it's why wells around here don't usually dry out, no matter how dry the summertime has been. Okay, home construction during a drought. Keep in mind that many building materials contain large amounts of water. Concrete, lumber, drywall mud, paint, all of that has a significant proportion of water in it. Also keep in mind that those materials are meant to be installed under certain conditions of temperature, humidity, those kind of things. It's very hard to meet those conditions during a drought. So installation during very hot, dry conditions can absolutely cause those materials to fail. On top of all of that, things like shingles are way more susceptible to heat damage during these really long, hot summer days without much rain, they're susceptible to physical damage when people walk on them. They literally get soft and kind of tarry, and it doesn't take much to damage them. So there's lots of things in new home construction that are hard to install properly during drought conditions. And the obvious one of those is concrete. Water in concrete may evaporate faster than expected during the curing process in the middle of a drought. When that happens, that leaves the concrete more brittle than what it should have been. Remember, concrete curing is actually a chemical process. It is not a drying process. That chemical curing process absolutely relies on the right amount of water being in that concrete to cure properly. So if we don't have the right amount of water in that concrete, if it's evaporating out because we're installing it during drought conditions, we're going to get a very weak concrete pour. On top of that, if we install it on dry, cracked soil, this is also going to cause problems when that soil hydrates again. When it rains, that soil is going to expand and damage the structure. If we pour concrete during normal moisture levels and a sudden drought comes along, that can lead to the soil shrinking and lead to our foundation cracking and sinking, similar to what happens with existing construction. So remember, we actually had quite a bit of rain right up until the moment this drought started, and it came on pretty sudden. So there's the potential for foundation damage on new construction that happened very soon after that drought started. The way to combat all this is you're supposed to keep the concrete damp and covered for a certain amount of time to help ensure a proper cure. How many builders right now with labor shortages, material shortages, housing shortages are actually going to do that? And the answer is probably very few to none of them. So drought-related concrete problems in new construction can absolutely happen. And it leads to weak concrete that can spall, that can crack, that can actually fail structurally because it doesn't cure properly. Lumber used during new home construction can also be problematic. Lumber usually has a very high moisture content when it's delivered to the job site. It's supposed to be no higher than about 8%, but lumber coming into a job site regularly measures 15, 20% on a moisture meter. So if that lumber dries too quickly during drought conditions, if it gets trucked in from someplace else damp, and then we put it up in a house being built under drought conditions, it is going to warp and twist way more than usual. This can happen to studs, it can happen to joists, it can happen to roof trusses, but it's especially true for exterior lumber such as deck materials. So lumber, which usually comes in very wet, even though it's called kiln dried, it still has a high moisture content, is going to warp way more during drought conditions than it usually would. And it's not uncommon for us to find studs, even during normal conditions, doing something like this. And it gets way worse during drought conditions. So the house framing is also pretty significantly affected during drought conditions as well. And then on top of all of that, things like drywall mud is actually going to dry out too quickly and shrink more than it usually would and cause bad seams. Paint's going to dry more quickly than it usually should and won't adhere properly to a wall and flake and peel off. So there's all kinds of things in new construction that can absolutely be affected by drought conditions. So we often build houses under less than ideal conditions, but drought in some ways, especially because it pertains so much to the concrete and the framing materials of the house, can cause more significant problems than say building during the winter can or something like that. Okay, so those are some of the problems that can occur during drought. Let's bring it around to real estate here for a second. Let's talk about some seller concerns. So concerns for sellers. Drought can cause or exacerbate existing foundation problems. It can accelerate that settlement cracking we talked about earlier. Very dry conditions may damage exterior surfaces like walkways, patios, things like that. And existing problems with some building materials or systems, such as truss uplift, which occurs when roof trusses actually shrink when they get really dried out, or marginally sized HVAC equipment that can keep up during pretty normal conditions, but when it gets super hot outside, can't quite keep a house cool, may be more severe during drought conditions. And when people see that, it can cast doubt on the home itself. So there are some things for sellers to be aware of. I would be primarily concerned with foundation problems suddenly showing up during a drought, but other things like marginal HVAC equipment can be a problem too. What are some of our concerns for buyers during a drought? Future foundation or other concrete damage may not be apparent during the inspection. Sometimes what we're talking about here can take some time to actually reveal or show itself. We talk about it being sudden, but in the world of foundations settling and foundations moving and cracking, sudden can be 6 months or a year. So these problems may be starting but may not actually be visible during that drought condition. So future foundation or other concrete damage may not be apparent during the purchase and inspection process. We talked about this earlier, but septic problems can often be masked by dry conditions and can be difficult to diagnose. And then if we extend that a little bit further, anything moisture related, things like basements that might have a moisture intrusion problem, ceilings that have a stain on them, all of a sudden are going to be completely dry because there's no moisture to actually feed that problem. So a drought can also mask other moisture related problems and make them appear old or inactive when they're just going to come back when we start to get rain again outside. And from an inspection point of view, even looking at those with an IR camera isn't going to be terribly useful during our drought because they're literally going to be dry and there's not going to be anything for that IR camera to see. So droughts can mask conditions that are going to come back later from a buyer's perspective in a house. What are some of the concerns we have as inspectors? Well, one of the biggest problems we have is it's impossible to determine the timing or significance of foundation cracking when we're looking at it because it moves too slowly, even if it's going on relatively rapidly by foundation settling and cracking standards. So for us as inspectors, it's really difficult to look at that foundation cracking and try and determine whether it's normal settling and movement or whether it might be the start of something drought related that's going to get worse when our soil regains its normal moisture content. When it comes to things like stains in basements and ceilings, we can usually find evidence of past moisture issues, but that drought makes it very, very difficult to judge the significance of that evidence. Is it something that's old and dried out and isn't going to come back? Or is it only dry because we're looking at it during drought conditions? The point here is that, like every inspection we do, an inspection during drought conditions is a snapshot in time. And while we will try and take those drought conditions into account when we're looking at that house, sometimes it's just kind of impossible to do so. And we won't know for sure until 6 months or a year later when we're back under normal moisture conditions. So a drought, just like a blizzard or just like very rainy conditions, is its own little snapshot in time that we have to try and account for when we do the inspection and warn people about. But it's going to be impossible to know how serious some of this stuff is until a little bit later on in the future. So again, remember, and I can't say it often enough, every inspection is a snapshot in time. Absolutely, some special consideration should be given to backfilling around a house during new construction. During a drought, the soil they dig out and pile around that foundation is going to dry out, and it's going to dry out rapidly. So when they backfill around that house, if they do not properly wet and compact that backfill over time, over a short period of time actually, it's going to sink and you're going to end up with divots or depressions next to your foundation that ironically are then going to hold water right next to your foundation when it starts to rain outside. So in the best of times, builders don't pay good attention to backfilling around their house. During a drought, it actually becomes even more important to pay attention to that backfilling. There are advantages and disadvantages to weather every time of year during construction. We get very few ideal times like early fall and late spring when our temperature and weather is ideal. Oftentimes during spring and winter, we're building when it's too wet outside or too cold outside. During the heat of summer, we're often building when it's a little bit too dry outside, like we just talked about here. So no matter what season you're in, with the exception of maybe a month during late spring and a month during early fall, there's always pluses and minuses to building during that time of year. It affects all of them. For us locally, I think it affects basement foundations the most because they're deeper into the ground. There's more surface area to push against the ground, and they're more susceptible during an extended drought as that dryness moves down during the soil. And then after that, crawl spaces, I think, would be a little bit less affected because it's a shorter foundation wall. And then slabs for us tend to be affected actually the least, which is funny. If you go down to Texas, there's very, very few basement houses because they have such expansive soil. So they're mostly slabs, and their soil can get so dry the slab can actually collapse in the middle of it and have to be supported by piers. But we don't usually see that here. Usually what we see affected the most are basement foundations. Excellent question. Natural wood or dimensional lumber is going to be much more affected by drought than engineered lumber. Engineered lumber is basically trees that have been chipped up into wood fiber and then glued back together. So the wood grain, the fiber in them, is not one consistent direction. And it's actually built that way to ensure dimensional stability. And then it's all glued back together again. So it is not going to warp and twist and deform nearly as much as dimensional lumber, which has all the grain running in one direction, and with modern lumber has very large growth rings in it that are more susceptible to movement as well. So we won't see too many problems with dimensional lumber, or with engineered lumber because of drought. Where we're primarily going to see it is with dimensional lumber. With extended dry weather, your air quality issues are going to move from mold and pollen, which we get more during wet weather, to small particulates. So when we get a serious drought and we get wind moving through here, it's going to pick up a lot of very small particles, typically soil particles blowing off of farm fields that are all of a sudden dried out, and they're little tiny silt particles, so the wind can pick them up and carry them. So it's going to move from being more allergy related to being more irritant related. And there are some plants that bloom better and actually do put off more pollen when it's dry outside, so the pollen load can shift a little bit. But generally speaking, we're going to become less concerned about molds and allergens, which require water to grow, and more concerned about very small particles and things literally like dirt in the air getting into our houses and irritating our lungs that way. And there's also some humidity concerns as well. You can have drought during very humid conditions, but if you have very dry conditions outside, that tends to exacerbate that problem that people have with the dust and the dirt that can get in the air during drought conditions. So humidity can play a role as well during an extended drought.